Imparfait, our third verb tense. The first thing to know about the imparfait is that it's a past tense. So I can hear you now. We already know the past tense, Madame Brenner. We just had a big thing about talking all about the passé composé. Here's the thing. Tenses are not as simple as you learned in elementary school. There's not just one present tense, one past tense, one future tense. That's not even true in English. In fact, depending on how you count tenses, English has up to 32 different tenses. French has, again, depending on how you count it, somewhere between 12 and 17 tenses. Yes, they all do fall into one of those three categories, past, present, or future, with the exception of if you consider commands to be a tense, which is a linguistical debate for another day. The imparfait, or the imperfect, does exist in English, as well as does the composed past, though that's not what we call it. The difficulty between the imparfait and the passé composé in French is that they use them in a different way than we use these tenses in English. So there's no way to look at an English sentence, there's no key words to look for that will tell you which one of these you have to use in French. It's a matter of learning the contexts and being able to figure it out on your own, whether or not you think a sentence fits into a certain context. I'll be honest with you, it takes a lot of practice. When I was a student, it probably took me about an entire school year to get to the point where I really felt confident with being able to tell if a sentence was imparfait or passé composé on the fly, without having to stop and really work it out in my head. Honestly, at this point, we're going to start with the three simplest uses, and we will look at some more complex contexts as we go forward. At this point, we expect you to be able to sort it out eventually. The nice thing is that at the very least, when it comes to identification in French, the imparfait is very easy to tell apart from the passé composé simply because it's not a compound tense. The imparfait is just one word. So you can look at any sentence in French and automatically know if it's imparfait or passé composé based on how many words are in the verb. If we start looking at uses, we're going to begin with the three most basic uses of the imparfait. So the first one is past habitual actions. Something that gets repeated frequently, preferably at a very regular time interval. Our second is a description. So anytime that we are describing, that we're setting a scene where we're giving off adjectives, or we're describing the weather, or we're describing things like how old we were. It's going to be a very common one in this unit because we're talking about childhood memories. And those will all be imparfait. And then finally, we're going to begin with our interruptions sentences, which is a little bit of a misnomer. If you think about when we're describing an interruption, all of those sentences have at least two verbs in them. So we have something like, I was eating when she coughed. We have the verb eating, and then we have the verb coughed. We have to say what we were doing before something else happened to interrupt it. The first action on the timeline, not necessarily in the sentence, but the action that we were doing that got interrupted, will go into the imparfait. The interrupting action, so the second action on the timeline, again, not necessarily the sentence, that will go in the passé composé. So we have one sentence that has two different tenses in it. Let's do a quick direct comparison. It's difficult to do it this way, but not impossible. So for example, we can say things like the imparfait is always used for habits, and the passé composé is always used for one-time events. Sounds simple, right? But let's think about the things that we might actually want to be saying. How often do you have to do something in order for it to be considered a habit? If it happens more than once, is it suddenly a habit? Because then it's technically not a one-time event, but only doing something twice in your life certainly wouldn't be a habit. We also have the interruption sentences that we were talking about before. So something that you were doing when something else interrupted you. Again, note that this isn't necessarily the first verb in the sentence. It's the first verb in the timeline is the imparfait. So earlier we had the example, I was eating when she coughed. I can flip the two halves of that sentence and still make perfect sense. When she coughed, I was eating. The timeline, however, didn't change. I was eating first, and then she coughed. So it's always best to think about these sentences in terms of a timeline. Do not necessarily say that the very first verb you see in the sentence is imparfait, because it might not be. And then finally we have our descriptions, which gets compared to events or actions. So here's another difficulty. We already had one-time events as compared to our habits. An event or an action compared to a description is when we're flipping from setting the scene to actually saying what's going on. So I often describe it as the imparfait is the scenery and the passé composé are the actors doing things in front of the scenery. However, if they're actors doing routine things, then it still becomes a habit, and then it's imparfait. You can see that even with these three, we have to really sort through a lot of context. There are more that we have to think about besides these three, but these are the most basic ones that will cover a vast majority of situations. So this is where we're going to start. Let's look at some example sentences, and maybe that would help. So for example, if we have the sentence, Alice played soccer every Saturday, that's going to be in the imparfait, because it's a habit. It's something that she did every single Saturday. But if I say, she even scored a goal in the state championship, I have to switch to the passé composé, because now I'm talking about an event or an action that was probably a one-time event. Here's a good interruption sentence. I was reading the newspaper when he called. So I have two different verbs here, reading and called. So I have to figure out which one of those two things happened first on the timeline. The easiest way to do these is typically the was. Look for the was or the were, and 98% of the time that's going to be the first verb that happened on the timeline. So I was reading the newspaper when he called. Him calling is what interrupted my newspaper reading. Here's another split sentence, and the kind of sentences we're going to be seeing a lot in this unit. I was 5 years old when I got my first dog. I was 5 years old counts as a description. We're setting the scene. We're telling you what kind of scene it is that we're about to tell you about. Be aware that every single time you're discussing a past age when something happened. So like I was 5 years old when I got my first dog. I was 10 years old when I moved. Whatever it was that you're talking about. Your age will always be considered a description. This is especially important because this is such a huge part of our next unit. The thing that actually happened, though, is an event or an action, and sometimes a one-time event as well. So for example, getting my first dog is an event, it is an action, I got my dog, and it's a one-time event because you only get one first dog. So question number 1, what are the 3 times that we've discussed so far you would use the imparfait? Would the following sentences be in passé composé or the imparfait? What do you think? All right, when we conjugate, we're going to just look at the stems today because the imparfait conjugation is completely different than the conjugations we've seen before. Primarily because in the imparfait, we don't really care about the infinitive. The imparfait conjugates not from the infinitive stem of the verb, but it conjugates from the present tense nous form. Now you understand why Madame Brown and I have been harassing you so much to memorize your present tense. In order to find our stem from the present tense nous form, we're going to drop the O and S, and whatever you have left becomes the imparfait stem. Sometimes this is the exact same thing as the infinitive stem. So for example, the verb aimer in nous aimons. To find the imparfait, we go find that O and S, we drop it, everything that's left becomes our imparfait stem, AIM. This is the exact same as it was in the infinitive. This is going to be true for a vast majority of ER verbs and RE verbs. These are almost always the same. However, sometimes it's not even close to the same. So for example, choisir, when we conjugate into present tense, becomes nous choisissons. To find our imparfait stem, we kill off our O and S, and what we have left is choisis. Not even close to the original stem. We have those ISS on the end of it. This is going to be true for most IR and irregular verbs, where the stem has nothing to do with the imparfait stem because they're coming from two different places. Irregular verbs, thankfully, find the stem the exact same way as regular verbs. So for example, if we have aller, we conjugate into the present tense, nous allons. To find the imparfait, we find that O and S and get rid of it. The one exception to this is être. If you think about it, it becomes pretty obvious why. How do we say we are? Nous sommes. So to find that imparfait stem, we go back, we find our O and S, it doesn't exist. Être is the only verb in the entire French language that the nous form does not end in an O and S. So it's the only one that has an irregular stem in the imparfait. We're going to use A, E accent aigu, T. It's the only one in the entire French language. All other French verbs, even if they conjugate irregularly, end in O and S and nous, except for être. So for questions 4 and 5, find the imparfait stem for jouer and avoir.